The morning Hester Wallace decided to cross Bitter Creek alone. The water was the color of rust and moving fast enough to swallow a horse whole. She stood at the bank with her boots already soaked through from the rain that had hammered the Oklahoma Territory for 3 straight days, watching the brown surge churn past logs and fence posts and the occasional bloated carcass of something unlucky. The sky above her was the pale gray of old pewter, threatening more rain, and behind her, stretching back toward the Wallace homestead, was the silence of a house that had been too quiet for 14 months. 14 months since Thomas Wallace had died of a fever that came on fast and left no room for goodbyes. 14 months since she had learned that love and grief could occupy the same chest at the same time, filling it so completely that there was no room left for anything else. But her cattle were on the other side of that creek. 23 head of longhorn, her entire livelihood, her entire future, and the only thing standing between her and the kind of destitution that sent women like her back east to live in the charity of distant relatives who smelled like camphor and disapproval. She had driven those cattle herself to the eastern pasture 2 weeks ago when the spring grass had started coming in sweet and thick, intending to let them fatten before driving them north to the railhead at Caldwell. She had not anticipated 3 days of rain. She had not anticipated Bitter Creek rising 8 feet in a single night and cutting her off from half her land and everything she owned that mattered. She had ridden to town the day before and asked Elmer Gratch, who operated the ferry 2 miles downstream, how long before the crossing was passable. He had scratched his jaw and squinted at the water and told her maybe 4 or 5 days, maybe a week. She had asked if the ferry could run. He had looked at her like she had suggested they both fly to China. She had ridden home and not slept, and now here she was, standing at the bank with a coil of rope over her shoulder and a determination in her jaw that had been put there by years of working land that did not want to be worked. The crossing was 40 feet wide at this point, maybe 45, and she could see the bottom in a few places near the far bank where the water thinned over flat rock. The channel in the middle was dark and deep and moving fast. She thought about Thomas, about how he used to call her stubborn as a creek-bottom stone, and she almost smiled at the memory, and then the almost smile passed and left the familiar ache behind it. She tied one end of the rope around the thick trunk of a cottonwood at the bank, tested the knot 3 times, and waded in. The cold took her breath first. Even in late May, the runoff from the hills was snowmelt cold, and the water came up past her knees before she had gone 4 steps. She leaned into the current and kept her feet moving in slow, deliberate shuffles, feeling for the riverbed with each step before committing her weight. The rope played out behind her in a long arc, angling downstream with the current. She had her arms out for balance, and she watched the far bank with the single-minded focus of a woman who understood that looking at the water itself was a good way to lose your nerve. She was halfway across, the water up to her hips and trying its level best to knock her sideways, when she heard a voice from the bank she had left behind. Ma'am, I would not do that if I were you." She did not look back. Looking back would shift her weight, and she was already fighting for every inch. "Ma'am, that current is serious." "I can see that," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. There was a pause. She heard the rope creak against the cottonwood. Then she heard a splash, and she knew without looking that whoever the voice belonged to had come in after her. She focused on the far bank and kept moving. The water deepened 1 more step, and then she could feel it beginning to shallow, the current spreading out over the flat rock shelf she had seen from the bank, losing some of its urgency. She planted her feet, pulled hand over hand on the rope, and hauled herself the last 15 feet to the far bank with her lungs burning and her skirts a dead weight around her legs, and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She pulled herself up onto the grass and turned around. The man was in the water. He was taller than average, broad across the shoulders, dressed in a worn canvas duster that was currently doing its best to drown him, and he was in serious trouble. He had both hands on the rope, and he was hanging on with everything he had, the current swinging him downstream in a long arc, his legs kicking in a frantic, irregular way that told her immediately he was not swimming, he was fighting. His hat was already gone. His face was white under 3 days of dark stubble, and his eyes were very wide. She grabbed the rope on her side and pulled. She dug her heels into the bank and pulled with everything she had, hand over hand, leaning back with her whole body weight, and he came with it, dragging through the water, not helping much because he did not seem to know how, just holding on with both hands and letting her pull him. When he was close enough, she reached down and grabbed a fistful of his duster and hauled him up the bank like she was landing a very large and undignified fish. He lay on the grass at her feet and coughed up what sounded like half of Bitter Creek. She stood over him with her hands on her knees, catching her own breath, and looked at him for the first time properly. He was maybe 30, give or take a few years, with dark hair plastered flat and brown eyes that were still slightly too wide. There was a jagged old scar along his left jaw, faded to white, and his hands where they gripped the grass were large and scarred in the way of a man who had worked hard his whole life. "You cannot swim," she said. It was not a question. He coughed again and sat up slowly. "No, ma'am," she straightened. "Then why in the world did you come in after me?" He looked up at her, and for a moment he did not answer. A muscle worked in his jaw. "I did not know what else to do," he said finally. "You were already halfway across." Hester Wallace looked at this man she had never seen before in her life, who had just nearly drowned himself following her across a flooded creek he could not swim, and she felt something shift somewhere behind her sternum. Not the large shift, not the earthquake kind she had felt when she had first laid eyes on Thomas Wallace 17 years ago at a church social in Missouri. This was smaller, quieter, the kind of shift that happens when something settles into a place it did not know it was missing. "Robert Slater," he said, getting to his feet with some effort. He was taller than he had looked, horizontal. He held out a hand that was still trembling slightly. "I ride for Kendrick's outfit over west of Garrison, was coming through looking for strays." "Hester Wallace," she said and shook it. "This is my land." "Yes, ma'am, I figured." She looked back at the creek, then at the eastern pasture beyond it where her cattle were presumably still there. "I need to check on my stock, 23 head of longhorn." "I can help with that," he said. "Can you ride?" "Better than I swim," he said, and there was a dryness in it that surprised a short laugh out of her before she could stop it. She had not laughed in 14 months. The sound of it startled her, and she pressed her lips together and looked away, but she could feel the color in her cheeks and she suspected he could see it. "Come on then," she said, and started walking toward the pasture. His horse was still on the other side of the creek, which presented a problem they both acknowledged and then tabled for the moment, because the immediate concern was her cattle, and whether they had survived 3 days of rising water with enough sense to move to high ground. They walked the half-mile to the eastern pasture with their boots squelching and their clothes heavy with creek water, and Hester went over the fence first, holding the top wire down while Robert followed, and then they both stood looking at the eastern slope of the pasture, where all 23 head of longhorn were in fact standing on the high ground, damp but alive, and looking at the 2 waterlogged humans with the profound indifference that cattle reserve for situations that do not directly involve feed. "There they are," Hester said, and she let out a long, slow breath that had been building since the water hit her knees. "They look fine," Robert said. He was standing beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him despite the wet, and she was aware of it in a way she had not been aware of another person's physical presence in a very long time. "They do," she agreed. She walked out into the pasture and began moving through the herd slowly, checking legs and eyes and the general condition of each animal, running her hand along a flank here, checking an ear there. Robert walked with her but said nothing, which she appreciated. A man who could be quiet around livestock was a man who understood them, and she noted this the way she noted everything, quietly and precisely, filing it away. It took them the better part of an hour to go through the whole herd. One heifer had a small cut on her front leg from what might have been wire in the floodwater, and Hester cleaned it with the cloth she carried in her coat pocket, pressing it firm until the bleeding slowed. The rest were in reasonable shape, better than she had dared to hope. She stood up from the heifer and pushed her hair back from her face. It had dried some in the time they had been working, the dark brown of it gone wavy from the creek water, and she was aware suddenly of how she must look, which was a thought she surprised herself by having. "Your horse," she said. "We need to get it across." "It'll keep until the creek drops," he said. "I can walk back to Garrison. That is 12 miles. I have done longer." She looked at him. He was watching the cattle with an expression that was calm and contained, giving nothing away, and she found she wanted to know what was behind it. She found she wanted to know a good many things about this man who had come into her water and nearly drowned for a woman he had never met. "You will not walk 12 miles, she said. "I have a barn. Your horse can stay on the other bank until the water drops, and you can stay in my barn until it does. It is the least I owe you." He turned and looked at her then, and there was something in his expression that she could not quite read, but that made her glad she had spoken. "I would not want to impose," he said. "You nearly drowned in my creek," she said. "The imposing was already done. Come on." They crossed back over the rope she had strung, Robert considerably more dignified about it this time now that there was a guide line, and a woman on the far end of it watching with an expression that left no room for any repeat of the earlier performance. He was still careful, still slow, and she watched the rope and watched his hands and said nothing, only pulled the slack out when it was needed, and when he came up the bank on her side, she handed him the rope and went to untie it from the cottonwood without making any comment about the look on his face. His horse was tied 100 yards back from the bank, a solid bay gelding with good legs and intelligent eyes. He retrieved it and followed her along the muddy track that led back to the Wallace place, a modest operation of 160 acres with a 2-room house, a barn that needed new boards on the south side, a chicken coop, a vegetable garden that was currently more mud than garden, and a well with a hand pump that Thomas had installed the year before he died, which Hester still considered the single most practical romantic gesture she had ever received. She showed Robert where to put his horse, which was in the barn with her own mare, Clover, and she gave him dry blankets from the tack box, and showed him the water trough and the feed supply, and left him to settle himself while she went to the house to get out of her wet things. She stood in the bedroom that was still half Thomas's in the way of rooms where someone has lived long and loved deeply, with his spare boots still under the bed and his shaving mirror still on the dresser. And she changed into dry clothes and looked at herself in that mirror and thought about the man in her barn. She thought about him carefully, the way she thought about everything, which was to say she did not rush it and she did not push it away. She just let it sit there and looked at it straight. She was 34 years old. She had come west with Thomas when she was 19, crossing Missouri and Kansas in a wagon that had lost a wheel twice and a mule once, and she had built this homestead from dirt with her own hands alongside his. She had learned to shoot and to doctor cattle, and to read the sky for weather and to run a fence line, and to do 100 other things that her mother back in St. Louis would have considered entirely unladylike. She had learned to love a piece of land the way some people loved a person, and then she had learned to go on without the man she had loved first. She was not a woman who wasted time romanticizing. She was a woman who saw what was in front of her and dealt with it. What was in front of her, currently, was a man in her barn who had come into a flooded creek. He could not swim to make sure she was all right. She could spend a week looking for reasons to explain that as something other than what it was, or she could put on dry boots and make supper and see what happened. She put on dry boots and went to make supper. She knocked on the barn door before opening it, which was a courtesy she had not known she was going to extend until she was already doing it. Robert was sitting on a hay bale with his coat off and his shirt half dry, oiling the leather of his saddle with a rag and a tin of neatsfoot oil he had apparently produced from his saddle bags. He looked up when she came in, and in the thin evening light coming through the barn boards, he looked different from how he had looked soaking wet and coughing on the creek bank. He looked settled. He looked like a man who knew how to be still. "Supper is in an hour," she said. "You are welcome to wash up at the pump." "Thank you, Mrs. Wallace." She paused at the barn door. "Hester," she said. "Mrs. Wallace was my mother-in-law, and I did not care for her much." The corner of his mouth moved. "Hester, then." She went back to the house and made a proper supper of salt pork and cornbread and canned tomatoes from the root cellar, and when he knocked at the door she let him in and set a place at the table, and they ate together in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which told her something she tucked away to think about later. He ate with the straightforward appreciation of a man who had been eating from a trail pack for a while, and was not inclined to pretend otherwise. He complimented the cornbread, and she thanked him without false modesty because it was good cornbread and she knew it. She poured coffee from the pot on the stove, and they sat with their cups and the lamp between them casting its small circle of warm light. "How long have you been riding for Kendrick?" she asked. "About 8 months," he said. "Before that I had my own place, small one, down in the Chickasaw lands." She heard the past tense and did not push at it. She knew what past tenses in a sentence like that usually meant out here: drought or debt or both at once. "Where are you from originally?" she asked instead. "Tennessee," he said. "Long time ago." "I am from Missouri," she said. "My husband and I came out in '81. She had said it straight without preface, the way she had learned to do it, because hedging around it made it worse. He nodded once. "I am sorry for your loss," he said, and it did not sound like the hollow thing people usually said. It sounded like he meant it. "It has been 14 months, she said. "I am managing." "I can see that," he said, and there was a quiet respect in it that she felt all the way to her feet. They talked for another hour. She found out that he was 31, that he had a younger sister in Memphis who wrote letters he answered infrequently and felt guilty about, that he had ridden everywhere from the Texas Panhandle to the Colorado line, and had never once found a piece of land that felt like it wanted him on it. He found out that she had 23 cattle and a barn that needed new boards, and a vegetable garden that was currently underwater, and a stubbornness that she did not apologize for. She did not find out that night that the most frightened he had ever been in his adult life was when he had seen her enter that water and understood she was going all the way across, and that there was nothing he could do about it except follow. He slept in the barn on a pallet of clean hay with the blanket she had given him, and he lay there looking at the rafters and listening to the rain starting again on the roof, and thinking about the way she had pulled him out of that creek without making him feel small for needing it, and he was not sure he had ever met anyone like her. The creek was still running high in the morning. He could tell from the sound of it, even from the barn, a low, continuous roar that said it would be another day at least. He thought about Kendrick's strays and knew he should feel more concerned about them than he did. He found her at the fence on the near side, looking at the water. The morning was clear, the sky washed clean by the rain, and the light was the pale gold of early spring that made everything look like the beginning of something. She had her hat on and her hair braided under it, and she was standing with her arms crossed over the fence rail with the posture of a woman who has been getting up early her whole life and considers it a reasonable arrangement. "Still running," she said without turning around. "Yes," he said. He came and stood beside her. They watched the water together for a while. The rope was still strung between the banks, swaying in the current, one of the more unusual things he had seen a woman do. "I need to get back to those cattle," she said. "I want to check that heifer's leg." "I can help," he said, "if you string that rope again." She looked at him sideways. "You do not have to keep doing things you cannot do." "I can manage the rope fine," he said. "I just cannot swim. Those are different problems." She almost smiled again. He was learning to watch for it, the particular softening at the corners of her mouth that preceded it, like the sky lightening before the actual sunrise. They crossed the creek again on the rope, Hester first and then Robert, and spent the morning with the cattle. The heifer's leg was better, the cut already closing clean, and Hester declared herself satisfied. Robert helped her move the herd slightly higher on the pasture slope, farther from the water's edge, working the animals with a quiet efficiency she appreciated, because good hands with cattle were not as common as people pretended. "You have done this before," she said, watching him turn a reluctant steer without drama. "Yes," he said. "Kendrick does not know what he has," she said, and turned back to her work. He stood with that for a moment, feeling something in his chest that he had not felt in a long time, before he turned back to his own work too. By midday they were back at the house, and she made biscuits and heated yesterday's salt pork, and they sat at the same table again with the same lamp, now unlit in the daylight, and he found himself looking at her hands when she was not watching. They were a working woman's hands, strong and capable, with a faint scar across two knuckles of the left that he found himself wanting to ask about and did not. That afternoon she showed him the south side of the barn. The boards had been going soft for 2 seasons, and she had been putting off the repair because there was always something more immediate, and because she could not do it alone, and because asking for help was something she had been raised to consider a last resort. "I have lumber," she said. "Thomas bought it the fall before he passed. It has been in the shed." He looked at the rotting boards and then at her. "I can help you with this." She was already walking to the shed before he finished the sentence. They worked the rest of the afternoon replacing boards, Robert pulling the old ones and Hester handing him new ones and holding them steady while he drove the nails. And they talked while they worked, the way people talk when their hands are busy and their guard is therefore lower than usual. She told him about Thomas, not the grief of it but the particulars, the man himself, because she had found that people were afraid to ask and she was afraid of forgetting. He listened with his full attention, which she noticed, and did not offer condolences again or change the subject, just listened and asked a question now, and then that showed he had been paying attention. She found out about the small farm in the Chickasaw Territory, how the drought of '85 had taken the well, and the bank had taken the rest, how he had ridden away from it with his horse and his saddle and $3, which he had since spent. She found out that he had a way of talking about hard things that was direct and unsentimental, but that did not close itself off. That left room for her to understand what the loss had meant without making him have to describe it. She found that she liked this more than she could have anticipated. They finished the south side of the barn as the sun was going down, the new boards pale and raw against the old weathered gray, and she stood back and looked at it with her hands on her hips and felt something that was adjacent to satisfaction but with a warmer edge. "That will keep for another 10 years at least," she said. "You could do the north side too," he said. "I noticed it was going." She looked at him. He was looking at the barn, not at her, his expression neutral, and she understood that he was asking to stay without quite asking. "The creek will not drop until tomorrow at the earliest," she said. "I have enough lumber." He looked at her then. "All right," he said. They ate supper again, and this time she made a proper effort, frying the salt pork with onions from the cellar, and making a pot of beans that were still hot when they sat down. And he said it was the best meal he had eaten since leaving Tennessee, and she decided not to examine too closely how much she appreciated that. After supper she made more coffee and they sat on the porch because the evening was clear and warm enough, the creek still roaring in the darkness beyond the cottonwoods, and the stars coming out over the territory in their thousands, the way they did out here where there were no city lights to wash them away. "There is something I have been meaning to ask you," she said. He looked at her. The lamp she had brought out was between them, and in its light he looked like a man who was prepared to answer honestly no matter what the question was. "Why did you not tell me you could not swim?" she said. "When you were in the water, why did you not call out?" He was quiet for a moment. The creek spoke for him in the darkness. "I thought about it," he said, "but you were almost across, and you needed to be across. I did not want to distract you." She looked at him for a long time. "You could have drowned." "Yes," he said. "And you still did not tell me." "No," he said. She turned back to the stars. She was not going to examine what that made her feel, not tonight. Tonight she was just going to sit with it and let it be what it was. "That was either very brave or very stupid," she said. "Probably both," he said. And she laughed again, a real one this time, not caught and swallowed, and it came out into the warm May night, and he sat beside her and listened to it like it was something he was very glad to hear. The north side of the barn took most of the next day, and by the time they were done, the creek had dropped enough that Robert's horse could be seen on the far bank, grazing peaceably and entirely unbothered by the drama that had preceded its owner's stay. They crossed the rope again in the late afternoon and retrieved the horse, Robert considerably more confident on the rope now, moving with a deliberate care that was not fear so much as respect, and she watched him from the far bank and thought about the difference between those two things. He should have ridden on. His horse was recovered. The Kendrick strays were presumably still out there somewhere, and another day would not help them. He knew all of this. He stood on the bank with the reins in his hand and looked at the Wallace place across the creek, and then he looked at the woman standing in front of it. "I would like to come back," he said, "if that would not be an inconvenience." The word inconvenience was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and they both knew it. She stood with her arms at her sides, and the late light in her hair, and the creek running between them, and she thought about all the very sensible reasons to say something cautious and leave room for herself, and protect the place she had worked so hard to get to, where she could stand up straight again after 14 months of learning how to carry something that weighed more than she had expected. "There is still fencing on the west pasture that needs attention," she said, "and the pump on the well needs a new leather seal." He looked at her steadily. "I can do both of those things." "I know you can," she said. "Come back on Saturday." He rode off toward Garrison, and she watched him go until he was a small dark shape against the late sky, and then she went inside and stood in her kitchen and put her hand flat on the table and breathed. Saturday he came back. He came with new leather seals for the well pump, which she had not asked him to bring, and a paper bag of penny candy from the store in Garrison, which she had certainly not asked him to bring, and which he held out with a slightly sheepish expression that made him look younger and was, she thought, absolutely devastating in a way she was not prepared for. "My sister likes licorice," he said, as though this explained the candy in some way. "I thought you might." She took a piece of licorice and looked at it. "You went to Garrison and thought about what kind of candy I might like." His jaw worked. "I might have done." She put the licorice in her mouth and turned toward the well. "The west fence first," she said, and she walked away before he could see her face, because she was not entirely sure what her face was doing, and she preferred to keep that to herself for the moment. They spent the morning on the west fence, replacing posts where the frost heave had pushed them sideways and restretching wire where it had gone slack. She taught him her method for tensioning wire, which was different from how most cowboys did it and better, and he acknowledged this without argument, which was another thing she added to the tally she was keeping, the one she had not admitted to keeping. Over the next several weeks he came back twice more. Each time there was work that needed doing, and each time the work took all day, and each time he stayed for supper, and each time the supper got a little longer, and the conversation went a little further into the evening. He told her about Tennessee, about a childhood that had been hard in ways he did not belabor but that she could read between the words of. She told him about Missouri, about her father's farm and her mother's opinions and the river in late summer, and the way she had felt the first time she saw the territory, how impossibly large and free it had seemed, how she had understood immediately that she could never go back east to live. He brought her a book from Garrison, The Third Visit, a novel she had mentioned in passing 3 weeks prior, and she held it and looked at him and felt the careful architecture she had been building around herself for 14 months develop a significant crack. "I remembered you mentioned it," he said. "I can see that," she said. She put the book on the table and looked at it and then looked at him. He was standing in her kitchen with his hat in his hands and his expression carefully composed, but she had been watching this man for 3 weeks and she could read him better than he knew. "Robert," she said. "Yes. I am going to say something and I want you to let me finish it before you respond." He went still. "All right. I have been alone for 14 months," she said, And before that I was married for 15 years to a man I loved completely and without reservation. I am not a woman who does things halfway. I am not a woman who enters into anything lightly, and I am not going to start pretending I do not notice what is happening here just because it is easier to pretend. Paused. I notice it. I want you to know that. He was very quiet. The kitchen was very quiet. The only sound was the wind coming through the gap above the window she had been meaning to caulk. I notice it too, he said. I have been noticing it since you pulled me out of that creek. You came in after me, she said. You cannot swim and you came in after me. I know, he said. Why, she said, and it was not the same question she had asked before she had wanted to understand the logic of it. Now she wanted something else. He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming through the kitchen window and it fell across his face, and she could see the scar along his jaw and the tired lines around his eyes that were the kind of tired that came from a long time of managing without much, and she could see something else too, something that was not tired at all. Because you were in that water, he said simply, and I could not stand on the bank and watch. She let out a breath. Come for Sunday supper this week, she said. Not to fix anything, just supper. He came for Sunday supper, and the Sunday after that, and the Sunday after that. By July they had established a rhythm that both of them pretended was entirely practical. He would come out on Saturdays to do whatever needed doing, because there was always something that needed doing, and stay for supper. And on Sunday afternoons she would ride over to the edge of the Kendrick property to the creek, where it was narrow enough to speak across, and they would talk in the fading light about nothing in particular for as long as she felt like staying. He never suggested she should stay longer. She always stayed longer than she had intended. It was at one of these Sunday afternoon talks that she told him about the railhead drive. I need to take the cattle north, she said, to Caldwell. I was supposed to go in the spring, but the creek set me back. I need to go before end of summer. That is a 5-day drive, he said. You cannot do that alone. I did the last one alone, she said. The last one, he said. How? Slowly, she said, and with considerable annoyance. He looked at her. I will ask Kendrick for the time. She turned that over. I pay fair wages. You do not need to pay me anything, he said. I pay fair wages, she said again firmly, because she understood what he was offering and she was not going to let him give it to her as something other than what it was. She was going to take it straight or not at all. He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, ma'am, he said, and the way he said it had a warmth in it that made the Oklahoma dusk feel warmer than it was. Kendrick gave him the time. Robert showed up at the Wallace place on the Monday they had agreed on with 2 horses, his saddle and trail gear, and a set of capable hands, and they drove 23 head of Longhorn north across the territory toward Caldwell under the big July sky. The drive was 5 days of early mornings and long days in the saddle and campfires at night, where the territory stretched away from them in every direction, darkening to violet at the edges, and then to black with the stars pulling clear. They talked around those fires in a way that was different from the kitchen table, more open somehow, the way the outdoors can make things easier that walls make harder. She told him about the first drive she and Thomas had made together, how Thomas had broken 3 fingers trying to control a steer that did not want to be controlled, and had laughed about it while she was wrapping them up. She told him about the drive she had made alone after Thomas died, how she had wept for the first hour and then stopped because the cattle did not care, and the land did not care, and she could not afford to either. He told her about the night he had sat outside the empty farmhouse in the Chickasaw Territory after the bank took it, how he had sat there until morning looking at the stars and trying to figure out what he was for. He said it without self-pity, as a plain fact, and she heard the loneliness in it without his having to name it. The third night out, the fire between them was burning low and the cattle were quiet, and the night was warm enough that they had pushed their bedrolls back from the heat, and she looked at him across the low flames and said, "When we get back from Caldwell, I want to talk to you about something." He looked at her steadily. "About what?" She shook her head. When we get back. He respected this. He turned and looked at the stars, and she turned and looked at the stars, and they lay down in their bedrolls and did not sleep, either of them, for quite a while. Caldwell was a busy, dusty, noisy railroad town that smelled of cattle and money, and the particular combination of hope and desperation that characterized every cattle town between Texas and Kansas in the summer of 1887. Hester had been here twice before and knew the market, and she drove a price for her 23 head that made the buyer blink and Robert watch her with an expression of unguarded admiration. She did not miss. She collected the money, and they ate a proper meal in the restaurant off the main street, and then walked out into the evening to where the horses were tied. The town was alive around them, the saloons lit up, and the piano music coming out into the street, and men moving in and out of the lamplight, with the particular loose energy of drovers after a successful run. She and Robert walked in the pocket of quiet that seemed to follow them wherever they went together, unhurried, not needing to fill the air between them. "You were right about the price," he said. "I am usually right about the price," she said. "I know what they are worth." "Yes," he said. There was a pause. "Hester." She stopped walking. They were at the edge of the lamplight where the boardwalk ran out and the dusty street took over and the stars were beginning to show above the roof lines. "You said when we got back," he said. She turned and looked at him. In the thin edge of the lamp glow his face was serious and quiet and entirely focused on her. "I know what I said," she said. "We are not back yet." "No," he said. She studied him, the scar along his jaw, the dark eyes that did not look away. The particular set of his shoulders that she had learned to read over the past months, the way they were straight and steady when he was calm, but had a certain quality of held tension right now that she recognized as barely contained feeling. "All right," she said. "Here then. What I wanted to say is that I think you should look at the south pasture, the 40 acres on the other side of the creek. Thomas always intended to build out that way but never got to it. The soil is good and there is water and it is sitting doing nothing." She watched his face. "I think it could run cattle, more cattle than I have. I think with proper fencing and good management it could run 100 head, maybe more." He was very still. "I am not offering charity," she said. "I am talking about a working arrangement. You have the knowledge and the labor, I have the land." And she stopped. She had got to the harder part. "And," he said, "and I am 34 years old," she said, "and I have been alone for 14 months, and I am not interested in continuing to be alone, and I would like to know if you are in the same position." She kept her eyes on his face and her voice very level. "That is what I wanted to say." The street sounds moved around them. The piano from the saloon down the block played on regardless. Somewhere a horse protested something. "Hester," he said, and his voice had gone low and rough. "I have been in that position since approximately the moment you pulled me out of a creek I had no business being in." She felt the warmth of it move up through her chest and into her throat. "Good," she said, and her voice was not quite as level as before. "That is good." He took one step toward her, and she did not step back, and he took her hand, which was the first time he had held her hand and not just shaken it. And she looked down at their hands together, and then up at his face, and she thought, with the particular clarity that comes when something long approaching finally arrives, "Yes, this is what comes next." He kissed her there at the edge of the lamplight in Caldwell, Kansas, with the piano going and the cattle town noisy around them. And she kissed him back with the full honest weight of a woman who does nothing halfway. And it was entirely different from everything that had come before it, and exactly like something she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. They rode back south across the territory in a different kind of quiet from the one that had characterized the journey north. This was the quiet of two people who have said what needed to be said, and are now occupied with the happy business of learning what that means. She told him about Thomas More, the part she had kept back, and he listened and understood that she was giving him something important and was careful with it. He told her more about Tennessee, about the river in summer and his father's orchard, the smell of apple blossom in the spring that he had not smelled in 15 years and still dreamed about sometimes. "You miss it," she said. "I miss the idea of it," he said. "The place itself is gone a long time." "A place can still be gone and you can still miss it," she said. "Yes," he said, "but you can find other things to have." She looked over at him in the morning light, his face turned toward the horizon, and she thought that of all the things she had not expected to find in the 14th month of her grief, this was the most complete surprise. They arrived back at the Wallace place on a Friday afternoon, the empty saddle bags and the lighter pace of the horses making the return feel like a kind of homecoming. She put the cattle money in the box in the kitchen, and she set water to heat on the stove, and she stood in the kitchen. She had stood in alone for 14 months and felt the space differently. He came to the door still carrying his saddle bags and knocked, which she told him was no longer necessary. "I do not like to presume," he said. "You followed a woman you had never met into a flooded creek," she said. "You already presumed." He came in and set down his bags and accepted the cup of coffee. She poured him and they sat at the kitchen table, and she showed him the south pasture on the rough map Thomas had drawn of the property, the 40 acres, and they talked for 3 hours about what it would take and how it would be done. And she found that their ideas about most of it were compatible, and the places where they differed were the kind of differences that are productive rather than the kind that are not. He went back to Kendrick the next morning and gave notice. Kendrick said a few unflattering things and Robert listened to them politely and rode back to the Wallace place. He arrived in the late afternoon, and she was at the fence line, and he swung down from his horse and walked to where she was standing and said he was done with Kendrick. And she said good, and they stood at the fence and looked at the south pasture together in the fading light, with Bitter Creek running quiet between them and everything that needed to be said already said. He moved his things into the barn in the short term, which she understood was the arrangement that was proper, and which she intended to change as soon as possible, and over the weeks that followed they worked the south pasture together. It took all of August and into September. The fencing and the clearing of the brush that had grown up along the creek bank, and the negotiation with Elmore Gratch downstream about water rights that was tedious and eventually resolved in their favor, because Hester had been here first and had the paper to prove it. By September, the south pasture was fenced, and she had purchased 12 more head at the Garrison livestock sale, which she drove out to the new pasture herself, and Robert rode beside her, and she thought about the first cattle drive, alone, and felt the difference in her bones. The evenings were getting shorter and the air was turning. One night in late September she made supper and they ate, and he helped her with the dishes, which had become a habit that neither of them had arranged or commented on, and after they were done, she stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark yard where the lamplight fell in a warm square on the ground outside, and she said, without turning around, "I think we should get married." He was very quiet behind her. She turned around. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before, something that was beyond his usual contained quality, something that had broken through the surface of it, and it was everything she had hoped to see. "Are you asking me?" he said. "I am suggesting it very firmly," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps, and he cupped her face in his hands, and she let him and looked up at him, and his eyes were the warm brown she had looked into on the bank of the creek, close up and serious and entirely present. "Yes," he said. "Hester, yes." She put her hands over his and held them there. They were married in October of 1887 at the small church in Garrison, which was a practical building of white-painted boards that smelled of cedar and candle wax, and that was full of the Garrison settlers who had known Hester since before Thomas died, and who had watched her carry those 14 months with a quiet dignity that had earned her the deep respect of everyone who knew her. Robert had no family nearby, but he had been in Garrison long enough that Kendrick's hands came, even old Kendrick himself, with a somewhat grudging respect for a man who had given clean notice. The Reverend, a soft-voiced man named Alcott who wore his collar slightly crooked, read the service plainly and without embellishment, and when he asked if they took each other, they both said yes with the particular clear-eyed directness of people who had already decided everything the hard way and were not confused about what they were doing. She wore the blue dress she had made herself in July with the material she had bought in Caldwell, on the same trip where she had kissed him at the edge of the lamplight. And he wore a clean shirt and a jacket she had pressed herself that morning, and he looked at her when she walked into the church with the expression of a man who is trying to be contained about something and is not entirely succeeding. Her neighbor, Mee Whitford, a woman of 60 who had homesteaded alone since her own husband died in '79, and who considered Hester one of the best women she had ever known, pressed a handkerchief into Hester's hand after the service and said nothing, just held her hands for a moment, and Hester held them back and understood everything that was in the gesture. After the small celebration at the church, they drove back to the homestead in the wagon under the October sky, which was the particular deep blue of autumn on the territory, and the cottonwoods along Bitter Creek had gone gold and were dropping their leaves into the current, and it was the most beautiful thing Hester had seen in a year and a half. He was driving, the reins easy in his hands, and she sat beside him with their shoulders touching and the warmth of him running down her side. "We need a name for the operation," she said. He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "If we are running cattle on both pastures, we need a brand and a name. Wallace does not fit any more, and Slater alone is not right either." He thought about this for a moment. "What did Thomas use?" "W bar," she said. "Wallace W bar." "We could keep the bar," he said. "Slater Wallace SW bar." She turned it over. "Or Wallace Slater," she said. "I was here first." He smiled, a full one, the kind she had been accumulating for months like something valuable. "Wallace Slater SW bar," he said. "Good," she said. "That is what it is." They pulled up to the homestead in the early afternoon, and he jumped down and held up his hand to help her down, which she took. And when she was down, she did not let go, and they stood in the October yard with the leaves coming down from the cottonwoods around them. "You should not have to stay in the barn any more," she said. "I know," he said. "Thomas's things are still in the bedroom," she said. "I think it is time to put them somewhere respectful, not gone but arranged properly. I am not going to pretend they are not there, but I am also not going to leave them where they are." He understood what she was saying, which was more than she had expected from him and less than she was surprised by. "I will help you with that," he said, "whenever you are ready." "I am ready now," she said. They spent that afternoon rearranging the bedroom, putting Thomas's things into the cedar chest with the care they deserved, setting the shaving mirror in the chest too, but keeping the small framed photograph of Thomas on the mantelpiece where it had always been, because this was her house and her history, and there was no reason those two things could not coexist with the new thing she was building. Robert looked at the photograph once and did not look at it with anything other than a quiet respect, and she loved him for that. She used the word deliberately in her own mind, loved him for that, because it was the right word and she was not afraid of it. That first winter together was a revelation. He was a good man to be in a house within the cold months, steady and quiet and competent, not underfoot and not absent. He fixed the gap above the kitchen window that she had been meaning to caulk for 2 years, and rechinked the north wall of the house, and built a proper workbench in the barn that she had not known she wanted until she had it. She taught him her method for preserving the root vegetables that carried them through to spring, which was different from what he had done in Tennessee and better suited to the territory, and he acknowledged this with the same easy respect with which he acknowledged everything she knew that he did not. They talked through the long winter evenings, the lamp between them on the kitchen table, the stove keeping the small house warm against the February cold. They talked about the cattle operation, about the plans for the following year, about the possibility of acquiring more land to the north where a homestead had failed and the quarter section might be available. They talked about his sister in Memphis, whom they were both by now writing letters to, and who wrote back with an enthusiasm and a sharpness of observation that made Hester like her immediately and wish the distance between them were smaller. And in the warmth of those evenings, in the small house on the territory. The love between them grew in the way of things that are given room and time, and the right conditions, steadily and without drama, deep-rooting itself into the ordinary days. In March, the snow still on the ground and the creek running with melt water, she told him she was expecting. They were at the breakfast table and she said it plain, the way she said everything, looking at him across the table with the morning light in the window behind her. He put down his coffee cup and looked at her for a long moment, and then he stood up from the table and came around to her side and crouched down beside her chair so that they were level, and he took both her hands and held them. "Are you all right?" he said. His voice was very quiet. "I am more than all right," she said. He pressed his forehead to their joined hands and she felt his shoulders move once, a single long breath that was something more than just breath, and she put her free hand on the back of his head and held him there for a moment. "A baby," he said. "In September, I think," she said. He looked up at her. His eyes were bright. "Hester." "I know," she said. "I know." Spring came fast that year, the way it sometimes did on the territory, the cold releasing all at once in a rush of green, and the creek running high for a week before settling back into its banks. And Hester stood on the bank one morning in April and looked at the water running clean and thought about the morning 15 months ago when she had tied a rope to a cottonwood and gone in. Robert came to stand beside her. He did this often, appeared when she was standing somewhere looking at something, and she had long since stopped being surprised by the rightness of it. Thinking about the crossing, he said. "Yes," she said. "I think about it sometimes." "So do I," he said. She looked at him. "When you were in the water," she said. "When you were hanging on the rope, what were you thinking?" He considered this. "I was thinking I was very cold," he said, "and that I had made a fairly stupid decision, and that I was very glad you had tied the rope to something solid." She shook her head slowly. "Robert, you could not swim and you went in after me." "I know," he said, "in a flooded creek." "I know that too." She turned to face him. "When did you intend to tell me you could not swim?" He met her eyes. "I was going to tell you eventually." "When?" The corner of his mouth moved. "When I thought you would not use it to argue against me coming back." She looked at him for a long moment and then she laughed, a long, genuine one that carried out over the creek and into the spring air, and he watched her laugh with the expression she loved most on his face, the one that was entirely unguarded, entirely present, entirely his. "You impossible man," she said. "Yes," he said, entirely without apology. She took his hand and he folded his fingers around hers, and they stood at the bank of Bitter Creek in the April sunshine, with the water running clear, and the cottonwoods beginning to green, and the whole of the territory laid out around them. And she thought about all the things that had been set in motion by a flooded creek, and a rope and a woman determined to reach her cattle, and a man who had followed her into water he had no right being in. The summer was full. They had 40 head between the two pastures by June, and Robert managed them with the steady competence she had known he had from the first morning she had watched him work. The south pasture was performing as she had predicted it would, the grass coming in thick and the water situation resolved, and they talked about the possibility of 100 head by the following year with the look of two people who could see the shape of something good taking form. He learned to swim that summer. He announced this one evening at supper with a casualness that did not fool her for a second. "I have been practicing," he said, "at the ford below Garrison." She looked at him. "Have you?" "Yes," he said. "I am not good at it, but I can manage." She felt the weight of what he was saying under the plain words of it. He had gone and done this quietly on his own, not as a dramatic gesture but as a practical one, because this was a land of rivers and creeks and she was a woman who crossed them when they needed crossing, and he intended to be able to follow her. "You did not have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He turned his hand and held it. "Show me sometime," she said. "Only if you promise not to rescue me again," he said. "No promises," she said. "I rescue you whenever I see the need." He smiled the full smile. "Fair enough," he said. Whitford came in August, the way she did every August to help with the preserving, and she sat in Hester's kitchen with her big capable hands moving through the beans and looked at Robert through the window where he was working in the yard and then looked at Hester with the expression of a woman who has seen enough of life to know good from not good. "He is a good man," me said. "Yes," Hester said. "Thomas would have liked him," me said. Hester was still for a moment. Then she said, "I think so too." Me nodded and went back to her beans. It was one of the best things anyone had said to her in a long time. The baby came in September, as she had predicted, on a night of early fall when the first hint of cold was in the air, and the crickets were still going outside the window, and Robert sat at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the wood and his jaw set while the doctor from Garrison, a practical woman named Dr. Vera Purcell, who had been serving the territory for 8 years and had seen everything, moved efficiently in the bedroom and told him when he could come in. He came in when he was told, and she was tired and flushed and alive in the bed with a child in her arms wrapped in the flannel she had prepared, and she looked up at him when he came through the door and said, "Come and see." He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held the small weight of it with a care so absolute that she had to look away for a moment because she could not look at it directly. It was too much. "A boy," she said. He looked down at the child and then up at her, and his face was entirely open, every wall down. All the contained quiet of him dissolved, and she saw the man behind all of it and loved him completely. "Thomas Robert Slater," she said, "if that is acceptable to you." His throat worked. "It is more than acceptable," he said. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, the scarred side, and he leaned into it. "We should tell your sister," she said. "I will write her tomorrow," he said, "first thing." "Tell her she should come," Hester said. "There is room." He looked at her. "You would not mind." "I have been wanting to meet her for a year," Hester said. "Tell her to come in the spring." He wrote to his sister Elena that week, and Elena wrote back within the month. A letter of such genuine joy and such pointed observations about the irony of her brother falling in love, while nearly drowning, that Hester read it and laughed until the baby startled and had to be resettled. The winter with the baby was full in a different way than the winter before it. Thomas Robert Slater, called Tom almost immediately, was a serious and watchful infant who regarded the world from very dark eyes that were going to be his father's brown, and had a set to his jaw when something displeased him that was entirely his mother's. He nursed well and slept in reasonable stretches, and Robert got up with her in the night with a straightforward willingness that she told me about, and me said that was how you knew. In December, a letter came from the Territorial Land Office about the failed homestead to the north. The quarter section was available at the government price, and they talked about it for 3 evenings and decided yes, they would take it, and Hester rode to Garrison with Tom bundled against her chest and made the filing and came home with the paper and spread it on the kitchen table, and they both looked at it. This 160 additional acres added to what they already had. 320 total, Robert said. "And room for more if the operation grows the way I think it will," she said. He looked at her across the table, their son asleep in the cradle he had built in November, the lamp between them, the territory outside the window in its winter dark. "You see it already," he said, "what it is going to be." "I always could," she said. "I just needed the right." She searched for the word. "Partner," he said. "Yes," she said. "That." He reached across and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand and held it, and they sat in the warm kitchen in December of 1887 and looked at each other across the lamp. Spring came, and Elena Slater arrived from Memphis on the stage to Garrison, a small, sharp-eyed woman of 27 with her brother's dark coloring and enough confidence for 3 people, who stepped off the stage, took one look at Hester and said, "Finally." "I have been writing letters to the territory for a year and a half trying to figure out what kind of woman my brother was making a fool of himself over." Hester shook her hand and said, "Come and meet your nephew." They liked each other immediately, which Robert watched with the particular relief of a man who had been hoping for this outcome and not entirely confident of it. Alina played with Tom and helped with the preserving and gave her opinion on the cattle operation with the freedom of someone who knows they are among family. And Hester received all of this with the open appreciation of a woman who had been working largely without female companionship for a long time, and found she had missed it more than she had known. Alina stayed 3 weeks and left on a Tuesday morning with the promise to come again at Christmas, and she hugged Hester longer than she hugged her brother and said quietly in her ear, "You saved him, you know, in more than the creek." Hester stood with that for a while after the stage had gone. She thought about it that evening when Robert was checking the cattle and Tom was sleeping, and the house was in the quiet that she no longer felt as emptiness. She thought about what Alina had said about saving, and she thought about the morning at the creek bank and the rope and the cold water and his hands on the rope. When he came in, she was at the window watching the last of the light, and he came and stood behind her, and she leaned back against him, and he put his arms around her, and they looked out at the spring evening together. The cottonwoods green along the creek, the cattle visible in the south pasture, Tom's cradle in the corner behind them. "Alina said something to me before she left," she said. "What did she say?" he said. She thought about how to say it. "She said you had been making a fool of yourself over me." He was quiet for a moment. "She is not wrong." She turned in his arms. "From the very beginning," she said. He looked down at her. "From the creek," he said. "From the moment you came up that bank." "Yes." She studied his face. "You hid it very well." "I tried to," he said. "I did not know if you were ready. I did not want to ask for something you were not ready to give." She thought about that, about the patience of it. About a man who had come into a flooded creek for a woman he had never met and then waited quietly for her to find her own way to him. "I was not ready for a long time," she said, "and then I was." "I know," he said. "I could see when it changed." "When did it change?" she said, curious. He thought about it. "The evening on the porch," he said, "when I told you why I did not call out in the water, when you said it was brave or stupid." She smiled. "And you said both. And you laughed," he said. "Not the short one you gave yourself, the real one." She looked at him. "You were watching for it. From the first time," he said. She put her hand against his jaw again, the habit she had settled into, the scarred side, and felt him still under her palm. "Robert," she said. "Yes. I love you," she said. It was the first time she had said it, and they both knew it, and she said it plain and direct the way she did everything, looking straight at him. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "Hester, I have loved you since you dragged me out of that water and did not make me feel small for needing it." She shook her head slowly. "You followed me in. I know. A flooded creek," she said, "without being able to swim." "I know," he said. "You are," she said, "the most ridiculous and the best man I have ever met." And he kissed her in the spring evening with the light going and the baby sleeping in the corner and the land spread out beyond the window. And she kissed him back with the fullness she had given to everything good in her life. And it was both the continuance of something and the beginning of something, and she was entirely at peace, with both of those things being true at once. The summer of 1888 was a good one, which in the territory meant it was not a catastrophic one, and was better than average on its own terms. The cattle operation grew to 68 head across 3 pastures, the North Quarter section turning out better than they had hoped, and Robert proved himself in the management of it with a capability that had by now drawn notice from other operators in the area. He had been approached by 2 neighboring ranches about consulting, which he declined because he was not interested in consulting. He was interested in building what was in front of him. She watched him become something on this land. Watched the man who had been riding for other people's outfits for 8 years put down roots in the Wallace Slater place and grow into them. And it was a thing she had not known she wanted to witness, and that turned out to be one of the great privileges of her life. Tom walked at 11 months, which Hester declared was ahead of schedule and Robert declared was simply what Slaters did, and they argued about this cheerfully for a week. By the fall of 1888 she was expecting again and told him the same way she had told him the first time, across the breakfast table on a morning with the light coming through the window, plain and direct, and he received it the same way he had received it the first time, by coming around the table and holding her hands, except this time he also kissed her first, which she appreciated. "Spring," she said. "Do you want Dr. Purcell again?" he said. "Yes," she said. "She is competent and she does not make a drama of it." "Good," he said. "What do you want for a name?" "If it is a boy," she said, "James, after my father." "James Slater," he said. "And if it is a girl," she thought about it. "Eleanor," she said, "for your sister." He looked at her with the open expression he reserved for moments when she had done something that undid him. "She will be beside herself," he said. "She can be beside herself from Memphis," Hester said, "and then come visit the baby. We will kill two birds with one stone." He laughed. He had a good laugh, deep and genuine, and she had collected a year and a half of them and was not close to being tired of it. The second child was born in April of 1889, and it was a girl, and they named her Eleanor Me Slater, the me for their neighbor who wept openly and unapologetically when she heard, and who came the day after the birth and sat in the kitchen with her big, capable hands wrapped around a coffee cup and looked at the baby, and said she was the finest thing she had seen since Hester herself arrived on this land. Robert wrote to his sister the same night Eleanor Me was born, by lamplight at the kitchen table with Tom asleep in his small bed and Hester and the baby in the bedroom. And when Eleanor received the letter she cried in the post office in Memphis and did not particularly care who saw her. She came for Christmas that year with a trunk full of things for the children and a manner of someone who considers herself entirely at home, which she was, because Hester had told her that plainly, that this was her home too when she wanted it. They spent Christmas in the small house on the territory, with a fire in the stove and Tom making himself a nuisance with his father's old rope and Eleanor, me asleep in the cradle and Eleanor Slater at the table, helping with the Christmas meal and Hester in the kitchen doorway looking at the scene. Robert came to stand behind her again, the way he did, and she leaned back and he put his hands on her shoulders, and they watched his sister dandle his daughter on her knee and make his son laugh. "This is what it is supposed to look like," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. They stood in the doorway together and looked at it, the small house full of warmth and noise and the ordinary particular miracle of people who love each other in the same place at the same time. He pressed his lips to the top of her head, and she closed her eyes for a moment and felt the whole of it, the land outside and the people inside and the creek running in the dark beyond the cottonwoods. Quiet now, no longer flooding, just running on the way it always had and always would, carrying things with it and also releasing them, the way water does. She thought about Bitter Creek in flood. She thought about the rope she had tied to the cottonwood and the cold of the water and the moment halfway across when she had heard his voice from the bank. She thought about what she had not known yet in that moment, that the man on the bank could not swim and was about to follow her anyway. She thought about all the things that had come from that one morning, everything that had grown from the fact of a woman who needed to reach her cattle and a man who could not let her go alone. It was enough to make you believe in the providential, she thought, and she was not generally a woman who believed in the providential. She was a woman who believed in work and planning and rope tied to solid things. But standing in the doorway with her husband's hands warm on her shoulders and the fire going and her children in the room before her and the land outside that she had built into something real, she thought that sometimes the world arranged itself with a generosity that went beyond what you could account for by logic alone. She put her hand over his. "Robert," she said. Thank you for following me into that creek." She could feel the shift of him behind her, the slight change in his breathing that meant he was smiling. "Thank you for pulling me out," he said. "I will always pull you out," she said. "That is my position on the matter." "I know," he said. "And I will always follow you in. That is mine." She turned in his arms and looked up at him, and he was smiling, the full one, and she was smiling too. And in the room behind her, his sister was laughing at something Tom had done. And Eleanor Me was making the small sounds of a baby who is comfortable and fed and safe. And the fire was warm, and the territory was dark and cold and full outside the windows. and she was exactly where she was supposed to be with exactly the right person, and there was not a single unresolved thing in her life. She kissed him in the doorway of the kitchen, while his sister made a pointed comment about people blocking the way to the stove. Later that night, after Alina had gone to bed in the small room they had added in the fall, and the children were both down and the house was quiet, she and Robert sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the coffee cups and the silence that was theirs, the particular warm quiet of a household at rest. She was looking at the map on the wall, the one Thomas had drawn and that she had added to over the years, the original 160 acres and the south pasture and the north quarter and the property lines. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I am thinking about the spring drive," she said. "We will have enough head to do it properly this year. 110 head to Caldwell." "I was thinking the same thing," he said. "We should hire 2 hands," she said. "It is too many for the 2 of us to move alone." "Joe Grady's boy is looking for work," he said. "He is a decent hand." "I was thinking the same thing," she said. They smiled at each other across the lamp. The synchronicity of it, the way their minds had been running in parallel grooves for over a year now, still gave her a particular pleasure. "We should write to Alina about coming in the summer," she said, "when the children are old enough to know her properly. Tom already knows her," he said. "He talked about nothing else for a week after Christmas." "He talked about her biscuits," Hester said. "That counts," he said. She laughed quietly. The lamp flame moved in the draft from the window, the one he had recaulked last spring, and then settled again. She thought about 5 years from now. She thought about the Wallace Slater place with 100 head and 2 children who would grow up knowing this land from the ground up, who would know how to work it and how to read its weather and how to cross its creeks when the creeks ran high. She thought about what it would mean to hand something like this forward, this thing she and Thomas had started, and she and Robert were building, this particular piece of the territory that had been worked into something by the best parts of everyone who had touched it. She thought about the south pasture and how the grass came in every spring. She thought about Tom at 11 months walking with the same determined set of the jaw she had seen every morning in her own mirror, and about Alina me with her father's dark eyes and her serious, watchful way of taking in the world. She thought about the North Quarter and what it would look like in 10 years. She thought about Bitter Creek running clear in the spring evening light, the cottonwoods along its banks gone gold in autumn and green in spring, the water moving on without stopping, carrying everything with it and releasing everything in turn. "Robert," she said. "Yes." She looked at him across the lamp. At the scar along his jaw and the dark eyes and the good hands and the particular quality of stillness he had that she had been inside of for a year and a half now, that she understood now as the quality of a man who had found where he was supposed to be and was not leaving. "I am glad the creek flooded," she said. He looked at her. A long, quiet, completely present look. "So am I," he said. "Hester, so am I." The lamp burned between them and the fire in the stove settled with a soft sound, and outside the January territory was cold and vast and full of everything that had ever happened in it, and everything that was still to come. And inside the small, warm house on the Wallace Slater place everything was exactly as it should be, closed and whole and good. The story of 2 people who had found each other on the bank of a flooded creek, and had, without fully intending to, built a life so solid and warm and true that it would outlast both of them and feed forward into the world in the forms of children, who would know how to tie a rope to something solid and follow when following was needed. Hester Wallace, who was now Hester Slater, who would always be both and was entirely at peace with that, drank the last of her coffee and looked at her husband and felt the deep root of a love that had grown slowly and truly in good ground. And she was not a woman who wasted words on things that did not need them, so she did not say anything more. She did not need to. He was looking at her across the lamp in the way he had looked at her across it 100 times, with everything he had already said still in his eyes, steady and warm and entirely present. And she held that look the way she held everything good that had come to her on this land, with both hands cleanly, without apology. The creek ran on outside. The children slept. The territory breathed in its cold winter dark. The lamp burned warm and steady. And they sat together at the kitchen table in the last good hour of a Christmas night, two people entirely known to each other, entirely held, with nothing between them unresolved and nothing ahead of them that they were not ready to face together, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.